What are the similarities between artistic research, the science of consciousness, and indigenous knowledge? Well, aside from the fact that all three areas for me are subjects of deep fascination, there are several other threads that connect them. One such thread is the importance of first-person experience, or in other words, subjectivity. But there is more to it. So let's consider the connections between all three. Starting with my favorite one, of course, artistic research. I won't go into much detail of explaining the understanding of artistic research, as I've done so in my previous video in which I spoke about similarities between artistic and indigenous research. So here I will only focus on what's important today. The understanding that artistic research is an attempt to explore art from the inside, meaning from the perspective of the artist-researcher, where he or she becomes both the subject and the object of inquiry. And thus, subjective insight becomes essential. Artistic research values intuition, emotion, and imagination. It asks, what can I learn by making, by performing, by creating something that didn't exist before? Therefore, self-reflection, awareness, and authentic experience become crucial in such research. Meanwhile, the science of consciousness tries to figure out how that authentic feeling even happens. It attempts to tackle what it refers to as the hard problem of consciousness, a term coined by philosopher David Chalmers. The hard problem asks, how and why do we have subjective experiences? Interestingly, both of these areas, artistic research and consciousness studies, gained prominence over the last 3 decades. If we look at the history of artistic research, we learn that academia began taking it seriously only around 30 years ago, when the study of art at the doctoral level was made accessible to practitioners, not only just theoreticians. The scientific world also became interested in consciousness as a measurable and researchable subject around the same time. There is even a notorious quote, one that, from what I gather, was reintroduced into contemporary conversation on consciousness by neuroscientist Anil Seth, one of the most prominent figures in consciousness studies today. So in his book, Being You, A New Science of Consciousness, published in 2021, he quotes British psychologist Stuart Sutherland, who once wrote, "Consciousness is a fascinating but elusive phenomenon. It is impossible to specify what it is, what it does, or why it evolved. Nothing worth reading has been written on it." This quote is from an International Dictionary of Psychology, published in 1989. It shows that despite millennia of philosophical effort to understand the nature of consciousness, the representative of empirical science were, until fairly recently, disinterested in the topic. That began to shift in 1994 with a landmark event, the first Science of Consciousness conference, held at the University of Arizona Medical Center. This event, largely initiated by anesthesiologist Stuart Sutherland, later led to the founding of the Center of Consciousness Studies, in collaboration with the Australian philosopher I mentioned earlier, David Chalmers. By the way, Chalmers is still credited with framing the fundamental questions that this interdisciplinary field continues to explore. And although Western traditions have long equated knowledge with objectivity, things that can be measured, verified, and repeated, the science of consciousness is slowly beginning to open the door to incorporating subjective experiences into its framework. We see this in the growing interest in the areas like meditation research, altered states of consciousness, and other experiential phenomenology. I had the honor of presenting at the Science of Consciousness conference in 2023 in Taormina, a town of remarkable beauty in the island of Sicily, Italy. It happened just before the conference celebrated its 30th anniversary in 2024. And I can confirm firsthand the conversation on consciousness not only includes but actively encourages new and sometimes radical approaches to understanding consciousness. In fact, in 2025, this dialogue expanded even further with the addition of the Festival of Consciousness, which followed the scientific conference in Barcelona and became somewhat of an unofficial extension of it, bridging science, art, and experiential knowledge. But creating first-hand experiences to expand our knowledge of reality and consciousness is by no means a new thing. It has been practiced by generations before us. This way of exploring reality is and remains an intrinsic part of indigenous wisdom. Of course, indigenous knowledge systems have only recently begun to gain broader recognition. It happened thanks to post-colonial thought, but even more so when the world began to confront serious environmental crises. At that point, Western thinkers started to realize that something crucial was missing from that toolkit. Coincidentally, a landmark moment here also occurred about 30 years ago, in 1992, at the UN Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. The Convention on Biological Diversity formally acknowledged the vital role of indigenous communities in biodiversity conservation. That marked a turning point in how we treat indigenous knowledge systems. Before then, due to their very nature, and the fact that indigenous knowledge is embedded not only just in minds, but in land, ritual, story, and kinship networks, it was difficult not only to recognize the importance of such knowledge, but sometimes to even recognize its existence. The challenge wasn't just epistemological, it was cultural. Indigenous knowledge was often collective, embodied, and sacred. These features stood in contrast to the Eurocentric model of individual, objective, and disembodied knowledge. Still, as indigenous knowledge systems, artistic research, and consciousness studies gain more recognition, a broader shift is occurring. The subjective world is drawing our attention, and understandably so, because if we once believed that knowledge was purely objective and somehow separate from us, we are now beginning to understand that regardless of whether an objective reality exists, we can only ever experience it subjectively. As Anil Seth writes, we see the world not as it is, but as we are. So acknowledging this subjective perspective and learning to understand it from every angle is becoming essential. Artistic research contributes to it by creating novel experiences. The science of consciousness helps us understand how and why those experiences arise, and indigenous knowledge reminds us to honor the roots of such experience, the interconnectedness of all things, and the importance of grounding the knowledge in the body and in the community that we are part of. These fields may appear different, but they share a deep underlying alignment. All three trust in the richness of lived experience. All three value presence, intuition, and complexity. And all three suggest that knowledge is not just something we know, but something we live, feel, and become. So perhaps the real invitation here is to stop asking which form of knowledge is superior and start asking how can they inform each other, how they can help us build a more nuanced and more complex and complete understanding of the world and our place in it. Because if we want to respond to the challenges of our time, not only intellectually, but also physically, emotionally, and relationally, we need all three. The sensitivity of the artist, the curiosity of the scientist, and the wisdom of the elder. And that, to me, is a future that is really worth researching. Thank you for listening, and see you next Thursday.